Every ship needs a captain, and if Nintendo is a ship, the captain was Mario. And this time, Mario was about to steer Nintendo through its first round of real naval combat. In the 80s, Mario captained the mighty Nintendo vessel through the treacherous ocean of terrible Donkey Kong ports, only to stumble into the SS Sega and her captain, Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, as far as the home console market is concerned, Sega enjoyed some success in the 80s with the Master System, but still fell far short of the NES. So they came up with a genius battle plan. They would become the anti-Nintendo. Nintendo was for families and kids who eat peanut butter sandwiches and read Magic Treehouse and whose parents love them. And Sega was for teenagers who listen to Linkin Park and tell their mom to f*** off. Nintendo was cute as a button, and Sega was sharp like a sports car. Mario had a harem, and Sonic hated women altogether. You ever play Doom Eternal with a Marauder, a demon that was designed for the express purpose of being the anti-Doom guy? If Nintendo was Doom Guy, then Sega was definitely the Marauder. Today's episode is set against the backdrop of the Bit Wars, and even though Mario is the name of the game, the Bit Wars are an imperative piece of historical context that cannot be ignored. But before we get to the games, I want to lay a really cool piece of history on you. Some of you may remember this from my Christmas fan game marathon, but John Carmack, the co-creator of Doom and co-founder of id Software, actually made a special game engine for smooth side-scrolling on the PC long before that was considered feasible for the average machine. And the demo that he created was modeled after Super Mario Bros. 3. And no, this is not an official Mario game at all, but in an alternate universe, it could have been. Carmack later made a more finished demo utilizing more Super Mario Bros. 3 assets and actually presented it to Nintendo, where it was seen by Miyamoto himself. Nintendo rejected the proposal of a PC port of Super Mario Bros. 3 despite being very impressed by it, but John Romero went on record to say that this demo was basically the reason id Software was formed in the first place. And with id Software came genuine FPS titles, which is a genre that is still going insane today, and it can all be traced back to an attempt to get Super Mario Bros. 3 running on a PC. That's just how important Mario is to the video game industry. He indirectly may have been responsible for the modern FPS. Alleyway for the Game Boy, starring Mario Bro himself. Now, if you don't know what Alleyway is, it's basically a portable knockoff of Breakout, and if you don't know what Breakout is, you're crazy. Basically though, it was Pong, except flipped 90 degrees, and instead of playing against another paddle, you were trying to bounce the ball into these rectangular pieces to destroy them all. There's an element of physics and momentum involved that still surprises me whenever I see it. To think that they had this much consideration for the real physical properties of a 2D ball floating through matter that early in the video game never fails to impress me. Repetitious arcade-style games like this are kinda perfect for the Game Boy because they are completely cohesive with the context in which you would be using a Game Boy. Whether you're on a plane or on a bus or in a car, it's important that you don't have an exorbitant time commitment to the game, and with something this easy to pick up and play, you definitely achieve that. Tetris, the king of puzzle games. If Mario is the face of platformers, Tetris is definitely the face of puzzle games. This is a game that operates on such an airtight and bulletproof foundation. It's a game that has been made and remade countless times, and it all started out here on the Game Boy. Hey Pino, I'm you from the future, where you did 3 seconds of research. Tetris was actually first released in 1984 for the Electronica 60 computer in Russia, and got ported to the IBM PC shortly afterwards. There were also ports for the Amstrad CPC, Amstrad PCW, Amiga, Atari ST, BBC Micro, Commodore 64, MSX, ZX Spectrum. Much like knockoff Breakout, Tetris is the perfect game for the Game Boy because it's incredibly easy to pick up and put down at a moment's notice. The rules are simple. Blocks fall down and you need to arrange them in a horizontal line to clear them. You get more points if you can clear more than one line at a time. It's all about that quadruple line score. If you can get that, then you're the man. Tetris is a game that is kind of impossible to complain about. I mean, name me one person who hates Tetris. You can't do it. It is a no-nonsense, no-bullshit, straight-up video game. Nothing about it feels artificial. It gets you into a rhythm and eventually starts picking up speed until you crack. It is a game that very gradually pushes the player to their absolute limit, and no matter what version you're playing, you can't put it down. And if you do have an endless amount of time, they also made an NES version which is a lot better, although it does not contain the classic Tetris theme, but the soundtrack is still a winner. Being an NES game, the color palette is far more robust, having colors like blue and red. It's called Technology, and it's wonderful. But for both of these games, you may be wondering, where is Mario? Well, if you get a good enough score, he actually shows up on this congratulatory screen. Unfortunately, I'm not good enough to see him, but at least we got Pit from Kid Icarus. At least I think that's who that is. I can't imagine who else it would be. Tetris would eventually get ported to every console known to mankind. This game is probably on more consoles than Doom. The majority of them don't feature Mario in any capacity, but at least you can say Mario got a job being in Tetris. Before I continue with the games, I want to bring up a non-game that I think is worth mentioning. It's the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, starring wrestler Captain Lou Albano as Mario. It was produced in large part by Dick Entertainment. Yeah, Dick. They would also go on to do work on the adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. Guess which one is better? I feel like this one is important because it's one of the pre-Martinet examples of Mario having a speaking voice. Back then, every intellectual property got turned into a cartoon. Even Rambo had a cartoon. But how did Mario fare in the world of animation? Well, it was extremely cheesy and had this goofy intro where Lou and Danny Wells start dancing and rapping to the beat of the Super Mario Bros. Theme. We're the Mario Brothers, and plumbing's the game. We're not like the others that get all the fame. If you think us in trouble, you can call us on the double. We're faster than the others, you'll be hooked on the brothers. Bam, bam, bam. Ba-da-ba-da. Apparently, people liked it so much that Illumination is actually using it in their marketing for the Super Mario Bros. Movie. I don't know what I expected them to do, but it certainly wasn't that. And then there's an entire live-action sitcom segment with a laugh track. It is funny, but not for the reasons they were probably hoping for. It's that kind of endearing awkwardness that's not great objectively, but is really hard to hate on because you can tell somebody was having fun. The cartoon itself is kinda cute though. They got all the music and sound effects from the games, the characters are all there, you got these corny ass catchphrases like pasta power, and Toad's voice is actually really funny. Although the first episode is really weird and involves Birdo mistaking Toad for her son even though they look nothing alike. There's also a gag in the after show where they're trying to help this woman and she keeps getting her clothes messed up. But then she reveals that she's headed to a party where whoever dresses the worst wins. So to help her win, they proceed to rub cake all over her that they picked up off the floor, and then it cuts to an ad for the Zelda cartoon. This is a very weird show. The show is carried by goofy-ass characters, the best of which is probably King Koopa. His voice is kind of fantastic, and what I aspire to as a voice actor. I feel like anyone who gets to play the villains in these shows has the best job in the world. I mean, it just sounds so fun. SMBSS is not perfect, and it might not even be good, but it is endearing and worth acknowledging. Kicks. Now this is a strategic puzzle game thingy where you play as a little dot and you have to draw wide enclosures with the walls of a giant whiteboard while these electrical fields and sparks chase you all over the map. The sparks travel along the perimeter, including the one you just created, while the electrical wave thingy chases you around the empty space. If it touches you or an unfinished line, you die. So you have to draw these big giant enclosures to get as many points as possible, except if you start making it too big, you're now a larger target, and if you don't space out the sparks properly, you can put yourself into a nasty situation very quickly. This is another perfect Game Boy title, one that you can just pick up and play at any time, and it's annoyingly addicting as well. I had a hard time putting it down, but thankfully it gets very difficult shortly after starting the game. Mario appears in this game wearing a sombrero and playing music in the middle of the desert. You know, Mario actually has an outfit kinda like this in Mario Odyssey. I almost wonder if it came from here. I'm not sure I understand the significance to the rest of the game, but maybe it doesn't matter. I am Dr. Mario and I am saving lives. Ayy! Mario is possibly the single most overqualified human being in history. Carpentry, plumbing, refereeing, golfing, and now he's a doctor. What's next, Mario Bros. Esquire? Dr. Mario is a simple puzzle game that is almost impossible to stop playing. The premise is that Mario's assistant forgot to sanitize his pill bottle, so now they're crawling with E. coli and staph, so it's up to you to throw a bunch of pills at germs to destroy them. The rules are simple. If 4 pills and or germs of the same color are arranged in a row or a column of 4, they disintegrate. You have dual-sided pills that fall to the bottom and you have to move and rotate them into place to eliminate the viruses. You can get more points if you use gravity to the advantage for combos. Just like Tetris, a single tiny mistake can have severe and substantial repercussions down the road. It's incredibly addicting, which is kind of ironic considering how addicting some prescription meds can be. So I've heard. For games that are this repetitive and endless, good music is a must-have, even though Kicks didn't have any at all. The first Dr. Mario doesn't have the most robust collection of music, but it's a very much quality over quantity deal. Much like Tetris, this is a game with a perfect foundation that you can play for an eternity, and although it never quite reaches the intensity of Tetris, it's incredibly fun and impossible to put down. Dr. Mario was also ported to the Game Boy, so you can play it on the go, and it's surprisingly very good. It's near perfect in comparison to the NES version, although it does have the obvious disadvantage of the lack of color. The audio is also slightly less robust, but that's also pretty expected, and it still has all the music from the NES game. And Fever even has that little bit at the end, which most of the other versions don't have, which ended up in the Smash version. And now you know where that part of the song comes from. Punch-Out got another re-release, but without Mike Tyson, so you can still play it, but even if you beat it, you won't be able to say, I beat Mike Tyson, so it's not the same. But I mean, you don't play for Mike Tyson, you play for Soda Popinski. F1 Race appears to be a Game Boy conversion of Famicom Grand Prix 2, which I liked a lot. I wouldn't call it a port because it's not quite on the same level. Otherwise, it's pretty serviceable, and arcade-style racing like this would have been great on the go. I didn't actually see Mario when I played, but I did see Toad, and a bunch of strippers. He always was one for overcompensation. Genesis. Sega Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis, had been out for over a year, and with an aggressive marketing campaign that directly called out Nintendo specifically, it was gaining staggering momentum. After almost 2 years of Sega's antics, Nintendo was quickly becoming the 8-bit punk-ass console. It looked like Nintendo could be the next Atari if they didn't play their cards right. Nintendo had their Super Famicom in Japan the year prior, but the dramatic explosion of Sega in the West made it more clear than ever that if Nintendo was going to win this war, they needed a big-name Mario game to legitimize their big new console, and stand up to their upcoming secret weapon, Sonic the Hedgehog, the edgy, sarcastic photo-negative of Mario.
He runs really fast and he's a lot more badass than that dickhead Mario.
Now, I gotta be honest with you, when it comes to Sonic 1, I am not the biggest fan. It's great for the first few minutes and then you hit the stupid marble zone. Considering this is only the second world, it is very frustrating that none of the game's strengths show up here, and it always makes me just want to play something else. And that's not just me being a Mario fanboy, I think Sonic 3 is legitimately good, it's just this first one that I don't like. Back then though, I don't think anyone cared about that because the game was badass. Visually, it made Super Mario Bros. Look and sound like an early DOS game, and the gameplay was fundamentally fresh, adding in the new dynamic of high speed and sprawling branching pathways and secrets. Levels had verticality and layers. It really was the future, not to mention the music was incredible. But hey, I'm not here to review every Sonic game. That comes later. You know, if you want me to. Nintendo's counterattack strategy was the Super Famicom, known elsewhere as what the f else, the Super NES, or more colloquially, the Super Nintendo. The big thing with the Genesis was that it was a 16-bit machine, which as far as the consumers were concerned, pretty much just meant that the graphics were 2 times more gooder. The SNES had to be a 16-bit machine as a bare minimum. The Super Nintendo came equipped with a 3.58 MHz processor, a 32,768 color palette, 8-channel audio, and an audio processor capable of... You know what, who gives a shit, but the point is, it was super. As for whether or not it was better than the Genesis, the answer is not quite as straightforward. Genesis had a substantially faster CPU, but the NES had other advantages. In practice, they're often fairly comparable, but I think the edge goes to the SNES because of things like Mode 7 and the Super FX chip. The honest-to-God truth is that it was before my time, so I don't have the most accurate historical frame of reference, but the point is, Mario as captain of the Nintendo ship needed to navigate the now treacherous waters, and the answer was this. Super Mario World is often considered to be the definitive Super Nintendo game. Right out of the gate, it needed to legitimize the Super Nintendo as the new sheriff in town, and to do that, it had to be more than Super Mario Bros. 4, even though that's what it was originally called in Japan. Now for my money, I think it was. My earliest memory of this game was playing it at the dentist office when I was 5, and it was fun, but I didn't really get far because they had to stick a drill in my mouth. Remembering this context, I finally understand why it is that it took me so long to play this game all the way through, because it always makes me think of getting a filling. It took me a very long time to finally circle back around to this game, and I'm honestly surprised. I knew it was a good video game, but I did not expect to like it as much as I did. From a graphical standpoint, the jump from Super Mario Bros. 3 is more clear than ever. Sprites are far more detailed, with a much more robust color palette. You can have more than 4 characters next to each other without the game lagging to hell. Putting that row of Koopas right at the beginning felt like a power move, like, this ain't your grandma's Nintendo anymore. I'm talking cutscenes, I'm talking power-ups, I'm talking dinosaurs, and I'm talking Yoshis. Super Mario World is yet another game that would influence Mario for the rest of history. Most importantly, it introduced Yoshi and Bowser's clown car, and speaking of Bowser, his stupid children are out for revenge. The boss fights have far more variety than previous titles. You got this badass death game where you have to try and knock each other into the lava pit while balancing on a rocking platform. You got this whack-a-bitch boss fight with fire bouncing all over the place. There's a recurring boss fight with 4 fire-breathing triceratops on a rotating platform. Wait, what's that say? Reznor? As in Trent Reznor? Dude, think about it. A Mario game with 9-inch nails working the soundtrack. That'd be so cool. Speaking of soundtrack, the music in this game is like the national anthem for any nerdy guy in his 30s. I'm sure if somebody started blasting the title theme in a very public space on a loudspeaker, there's a non-zero chance that a bunch of dudes will start tearing up and sniffling like I do whenever somebody plays Sins of the Father. It probably sounds like I'm making fun of you for that, but listen, man. I get it. It's Mario. He's my family. A lot of that music would also carry over to future Mario titles. On the other hand, the soundscapes and sound effects are incredibly atmospheric. When you go into the caves, everything has this echoey reverb effect that makes you feel like the speakers are underground. I think the real game-changing element of Super Mario World for me, though, is the fact that it really does feel like a world and not just a straightforward marathon of one level after another after another. Unlike Super Mario Bros. 3, you can always replay levels and travel back to previous worlds you've already been to, not to mention it's all connected, which gives it a real sense of cohesion. By the time you've beaten this game, you really do feel like you've been all over Dinosaur World. Levels are far more detailed and make far greater use of verticality and layers, with rewarding secrets hidden all over the place. There's so many secret paths and exits that it makes your head spin. The foundation is very similar to its predecessors, but steps out of their shadow to be something incredibly refined and innovative. This is a legitimate video game even by today's standards. On top of being a very tight and polished piece of work with a lot of variety, there are also so many moments of this game that are just simply really cool. Playing it really makes you feel like the Mario Man. Difficulty-wise, it's easier than its predecessors by a wide margin. For one thing, you actually have a save system, which is kind of necessary for a game of this size and scope. There's also a level of fluidity to the platforming that isn't there in the NES titles. The game is far more open to experimentation, with moves like kicking Koopa shells upwards or using Yoshi to spit balls of fire. It's just badass, and it took me a very long time to appreciate it, longer than I'd like to admit. It is a legitimately good video game that is not only entirely accessible by today's standards, but also genuinely fun to play and to watch, and if you've somehow missed out on it all these years, I'm telling you, give it a spin. This is the big time, boyos, none of that 8-bit crap. This is a real video game, for real men. VS Dr. Mario for the VS Arcade system. Well, it's the same game as before, but for the arcade. It's not a bad idea, it is a very arcade-worthy game after all, and it's definitely still a lot of fun. They also made a Play Choice 10 version, which seems a tad redundant considering they already had an arcade version, but hey, that's why I don't run Nintendo. NES Open Tournament Golf is easily the best version of golf so far. Fundamentally, it's the same game, but the presentation has been cranked up very high. It is a far more cinematic golfing experience, with changing perspectives and ground view close-ups of the ball dropping into the hole. It also has more courses than any of the previous versions, including the US courses, Japanese courses, and UK courses. This is closer to Mario Golf than any previous version, with Mario and his friends having a much greater presence than before. Otherwise, it's golf, which makes it my favorite game. It was also on the Play Choice 10 system, you know, if you're into that kind of thing. Even with the Super Nintendo in a very competitive place in what was now a video game duopoly, Nintendo still felt the need to sink to the depths of hell. That's right, I'm talking educational games for the PC. I'm talking Super Mario Bros. And Friends, When I Grow Up. You know, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a game designer. Then I learned that the video game industry is full of evil people. So I just started a YouTube channel instead, because YouTube is the cornerstone of good-natured human beings. Now as for the game, this is a picture coloring game where you fill in the blank spots with colors. I don't think there's any meta game or a way to really win or lose, you pretty much just color. The theme is Mario Bros. And Friends holding all kinds of different jobs. There's a little blurb at the beginning where they talk about what the job is and what it involves. I used to love these kinds of games when I was like 6. Playing something like this as an adult, you know, people just look at you funny, but I gotta pay respects for bringing back Mauser. I love that guy. Mario the Juggler was the last Mario game produced for the Game & Watch for almost 3 straight decades. By now the Game Boy was well established, so the Game & Watch was a dinosaur. The game itself is typical Game & Watch stuff with an endless gameplay loop that can be mastered in 10 seconds. Don't quit your day job, Mario. Then we got Yoshi for the NES. This is a puzzle game where 4 columns of Mario NPCs fall down and you have to swap the columns in real time to get enemies of the same type to connect and dissipate. Except you also got these Yoshi eggs falling down. The real goal is to spawn Yoshis by sandwiching a bunch of enemies into an egg, and the more enemies you get into an egg, the bigger the Yoshi you spawn. I guess you could say it's a Big Yoshi. It's alright, but it gets old pretty quickly. It doesn't have the same staying power as something like Dr. Mario. The strategy element isn't really there, and it feels a little too simple. And the music, I'm just not feeling it. You can't really have a game like this without great music that never gets old, so the game runs out of steam very quickly. It did get a Game Boy version as well, and even though it's 95% the same, it fits the portable handheld model a little bit better. Other than that, Yoshi is a video game. So, yeah. Super Mario Bros. 2 USA is the USA version of Super Mario Bros. 2 except released in Japan. It's a bit of an interesting decision considering people in Japan were already familiar with Doki Doki Panic, which it was based on, but I guess if putting Mario on it is what it takes to get it to sell more than 3 copies, you better do it. Mario teaches typing. Now this is an interesting one. For a long time, knowing how to type was actually considered to be a special skill. It's not like today where it's something that everyone is expected to just know how to do. When home PCs started to emerge for regular people, it became apparent that computers were the future and it would become an expected skill just to be able to participate in society. So companies started making games that would teach people how to type, many of which were intended for children. I think they've since gone out of style because pretty much every kid is born with a phone in their hands, and they can't download Fortnite without learning how to type the word Fortnite into a search bar. There is a lot of value into making learning fun. I imagine a lot of kids probably thought, typing? Who gives a shit about that? But when you go, hey, type this summary of the American Civil War or Mario dies, it adds a lot more urgency. If they made Mario teaches calculus, I might have gotten my comp-sci degree. Typing games always make me feel like an insane person because for a brief moment of time it feels like I forgot how to type. I can type up a Word document just fine. I mean, I wrote the script, right? But the flow in a game like this is completely different. When I make a mistake in a doc, I hit backspace a couple times and then fix it. Here, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to keep right on trucking, but if you get into a rhythm and make a mistake, it counts every individual keystroke as a separate error, meaning it can go off the rails pretty quickly. It's stupid how addicting this is to me. I keep feeling like I have to get better at this, even though my skills at a typing game aren't really indicative of my ability to type in any capacity where it would actually be necessary. There are a handful of different typing minigames, but my favorite is this one where you get facts about American history and you have to type out complete sentences as they come as Mario is running and swimming for his life. The image of Mario being a second away from dying while the player is having a heart attack trying to type out George Washington's favorite food was Reese Puffs is just hilarious to me. As a side note, this is another example of a pre-Martinet portrayal of Super Mario.
Welcome to Mario Teaches Typing!
Super Scope 6 is a game for the SNES Super Scope. Nintendo's legacy of funky gimmicks is often attributed to stuff like the Wii, but they had actually been experimenting with weird controllers and peripherals long before that. The NES had things like the Zapper and the Power Glove, and the SNES had the Super Scope. This thing was serious business. It was a big gray bazooka with a scope. And to sell people on this thing, they bundled it with a game called Super Scope 6, which is a collection of 6 minigames. If Super Nintendo was before your time, you might remember Wii Sports and Wii Play, which were designed for the express purpose of showing off what the Wii remote could do. Super Scope 6 is pretty much that, but for the Super Scope. You can't really appreciate this game unless you're playing on original hardware with an actual Super Scope. It's easy to emulate, but dragging a mouse around to shoot things just isn't the same. That being said, the mini-games here are not so bad. There's this weird Tetris thing where you need to actually manipulate blocks into falling into perfect lines by shooting individual sections. There's also this one where you shoot down flying mech suits and another one where you had to shoot down missiles and fighter jets. This one is actually pretty cool because you need to lead your target depending on how far away they are. And no, I didn't forget about Mario. He shows up in a plane getting attacked by one of the Koopa kids. As you can see, it's some serious shit. Speaking of funny peripherals, Super Nintendo also had a mouse, and the killer app for the Super Nintendo mouse was Mario Paint, a Mario-themed painting game where you can paint Marios. Yeah. To tell you the truth, the paint aspect of this game has never been that exciting to me. But what is cool is the composer section, where you can make your own songs. Mario Paint Composer has become its own thing, with people reverse engineering fan-made programs that accommodate the weaknesses of the original game. Back in the day, Mario Paint remixes used to be pretty popular. I'm pretty sure that you could find remixes for just about any song out there. Despite the fact that the game is called Mario Paint, I think the game's legacy lives on in the Paint Composer more than anything else. And to be honest, I wouldn't have it any other way. Super Mario Kart. Now this is what we call a landmark title. Today, when a lot of people think of Mario, they think of Mario Kart. For a spin-off title to be the first thing a lot of people think of when they hear Mario, it's kind of a big deal. It is an incredibly potent formula that has proven again and again and again to be extremely successful. I don't think there has ever been a single Mario Kart game that didn't sell 3 billion copies. It's the one game that everybody is expected to own if they have a Nintendo console. Not even Smash sells as much as Mario Kart. Some of my best gaming memories are from Mario Kart 64, Double Dash, and more recently, 8. And none of those games would have existed without the OG Super Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo. So its importance with respect to Nintendo and Mario history is absolutely impossible to overstate.
It's one of my greatest achievements, you know. Hell. Oh, well, that will do that work.
Oh my god! That being said, when it comes to Super Mario Kart itself, I am not the biggest fan. After trying to get through this game at least 20 times in my life, it had just never clicked with me the way I think it should. Yes, this is the first game in the series, so it's not fair to judge it by modern standards, whether that be mechanically or by the absence of mechanics and elements that we now take for granted. And admittedly, there are a lot of things that I do like about it. The music is really catchy and gets you ready to roll. The graphics are cool and perhaps one of the most exemplary uses of Super Nintendo's Mode 7 capabilities. It wasn't the first game to utilize its potential, but it was very effective. In my previous video, I alluded to the developer's pursuit of 3D and the desire to fully achieve a free range of movement. And with that in mind, what SNES had going on here, it was pretty neat for the time. The Mario Kart series is famous for being accessible to everyone. I think what it comes down to is the item system. Because it's so chaotic and possibly even broken, it means that the game is never over until it's over. Even an inexperienced player is allowed to stay in the race because the item system is so crazy and compensates a lack of skill. At least with the more modern titles. Compared to the future titles though, Super Mario Kart is not very liberal with items at all, and the items you do get are rarely game-changing. Mushrooms are only helpful if you're on a perfectly straight path. I have never hit anybody with the green shell except for myself, and also I'm pretty sure NPCs are literally just allowed to use power-ups whenever they want. Like I saw Luigi turn invincible several times in a row without ever once hitting an item box. This is where Super Mario Kart falls short for me, actually playing the game. When it works, it's a lot of fun, but when things go wrong, it goes down hard and it goes down fast. Fall off a cliff, get put back on, other drivers bump into you and disorient you, didn't turn in time, now driving into a decaying wall and you can't even drive in reverse to correct it, so now you had to drive off and die. One tiny mistake can you for the entire thing, as it creates a crashing domino effect of nonsense. And there are a lot of maps where you're constantly slowing down so you don't fall off a cliff or bump into a wall because the drifting is just ass. Turning corners in this game has never felt great, no matter which character I play. Bowser handles like a minivan in GTA 4, and Koopa, who I started playing instead, is basically a pinball who gets chucked all over the place by everyone. Everything feels disproportionately punishing, and it very quickly stops being fun. And I swear I've seen NPCs just drive through solid obstacles like nothing. The real draw of the game is the two-player feature, which is a lot of fun because both players are bound by the same drawbacks, making it feel far less artificial and more leveled. The racing is fun, but balloon battle is where it's really at. And really, the robust multiplayer has always been the best part of Mario Kart.
And Donkey Kong showed up, and I'm just like,
Oh, great. Now fucking Donkey Kong is here. And,
I've
just in time for me to get in second place.
Sorry about that.
The bottom line is that Super Mario Kart is definitely incredibly wonky by today's standards, but it's also a very important piece of history without which Nintendo and Mario would look very different than they do today. Also, in the Japanese version, when Peach wins the Grand Prix, she immediately starts getting drunk, and it's really funny. It's a shame the localization removed it. I might understand why, but it doesn't make me any less sad. All of this is just one person's opinion, mind you. There are a lot of people who like this game, and the lack of excessive item boxes could be argued as making the game far more skill-based. There are definitely arguments in favor of this game, but if I had to choose a Mario Kart to play for the rest of my life, it would definitely not be this one. Let me take you back to the previous episode where I spoke about a little game called Super Mario Land. This was considered to be a technical marvel, although it was held back by a lack of polish and by being a relatively brief game that could be beaten in an hour. Now this is Super Mario Land 2. This game is such a dramatic step up from its predecessor that it's not even funny. Everything about this game is better. Graphics, sound effects, soundtrack, controls, plot, setting, polish. It really is a lot like Super Mario Bros. 3 in that it looks like it could have been on another console entirely. Playing this game after playing a bunch of prior Game Boy titles for the marathon is such a dramatic whiplash, it doesn't even feel like a Game Boy game. It is an achievement for being exponentially larger than its predecessor, but it's also so great because it was the first game to feature Wario. I'm gonna win. The premise is that Mario left his castle unattended because apparently he had a castle this whole time. So Wario snuck in the back door and just decided that he lived there now. So Mario has to collect 6 golden coins to get back inside and stop Wario from seeing his browser history. I actually have a deep nostalgic connection to this game in particular. When most people think of Mario, they think of Super Mario World, Bros, 64, Galaxy, Odyssey. That's a Mario game. But when I was a little kid, this was my big Mario game. It was one of the first games that I can actually remember beating all the way through. I had my brother's Game Boy Color, which I kinda stole because he wasn't using it anymore. I had the cartridge and some double A's and I would play it late at night next to a crappy room light. I pulled an all-nighter just getting all the coins and trying to find everything before the final battle with Wario, who I didn't even know was the antagonist at the time. It was a really memorable gaming moment for me. The mystery, the anticipation, the fear of not knowing what would be at the end of this gauntlet of fire and bricks. Super Mario Land 2 really is a magical game. Even though the core gameplay is reminiscent of its home console predecessors, it feels very much like its own thing. If you've ever played Link's Awakening, which is famous for being super weird and not exactly Zelda-like, this is kinda like that. There's a very whimsical, very bizarro, dreamlike quality to this game that is even more potent than most Mario titles. You enter Robot Mario's foot and go to the Lego dimension. There's a Halloween level where you get attacked by a bunch of Jason Voorheeses. And there's also a bunch of decapitated fish. That's what it looks like. You get eaten by a giant turtle and there's a big whale inside of the turtle who also eats you. There's a hippo that breathes a snot bubble, so you ride it to a secret exit which brings you into space. Instead of relying on a robust number of power-ups and mechanics, Super Mario Land 2 is more interested in the variety of level designs, both from a visual standpoint and a gameplay standpoint. In terms of difficulty, this is a game that is a lot more forgiving than previous Mario platformers. It hands out 1-ups like candy, you can spend coins to spin a wheel to get even more, upgrades actually give you 2 extra hits of damage instead of just 1, and the platforming has a lot of room for maneuverability thanks in no small part to the bunny ears which let you slowly float down with complete aerial control. It's a relatively easygoing game, that is, until you reach Wario's castle. This level is an endless gauntlet of giant spike balls, fire-breathing piranha plant statues, and one death trap after another. You got weighted tiles that spawn giant Wario fists from the ceiling. Getting through this final level as a kid truly was a triumphant endeavor. You got that scary music, the deadly platforming, the creepy, oppressive atmosphere. It stands out completely from the rest of the game, which is already very unique. That build-up to a spectacular reveal of big-ass Wario just dicking around in the throne room like an asshole was truly spectacular for a Game Boy game, and it makes the first Super Mario Land look like Donkey Kong for the Intellivision. Unlike the first game, this is far more serviceable and aged much more gracefully, and in my opinion, this is the definitive Game Boy title, and if you haven't played it yet, it's definitely a bucket list title at least. It is a game that is not only great in its own right, but holds many memories for myself, and I treasure it deeply. Yoshi's Cookie is a game that was released for the Famicom and Game Boy in Japan in '92 and localized later, with another Super Nintendo version released worldwide the following year. It was made by a company called Bulletproof Software, and nothing says bulletproof like cookies. Let's talk about the NES one first. In this game, you slide cookies by column or row to arrange identical cookies in a row or column. The goal is to destroy all the cookies on the screen, but more cookies start entering the mix, which you can use to get more points and combos, but it's more risky because you can die if it fills up too quickly. It's not the best thing in the world, but it's way better than Yoshi. There's a higher skill ceiling and more potential to pull off crazy combos. Yoshi mostly shows up in cutscenes, so it's more of a Mario thing than a Yoshi thing, but I guess Mario Cookie didn't sound as cool. The Game Boy version is pretty much the same, except Yoshi actually helps out at the Cookie Factory, which is more than can be said for the NES version. Really, the best version of Yoshi's Cookie is definitely the Super Nintendo version. It's fundamentally the same as the others, except this time, it actually has graphics. It is a much more vibrant, much more animated game with a lot more color and detail than ever before. Cutscenes are far more expressive, showing close-ups of Mario catching cookies and sometimes running away from them. These things are no joke. Turns out being bulletproof doesn't mean much in a world where cookies are the biggest danger to you. Super Mario Race was developed for the Nelsonic Game Watch, likely inspired by Super Mario Kart. Unfortunately, I have not been able to play this one, much like the Super Mario Bros. Titles, but I'm sure it's a wild ride. The year is 1993, and the PC is now a legitimate gaming platform thanks in big part to that FPS game. What is it called? Boom? No. Doom. That's right, 3D graphics are becoming real, and in a few years Mario's gonna learn, big time. But first he needs an education, which brings us to Mario is Missing. Now, Mario is Missing is one of the more bizarre Mario games from this era. In its first iteration, it was a point-and-click game for the forbidden PC platform. They were later put on NES and Super Nintendo, which became the subject of an AVGN episode from 2011. Now that's a bad sign right there. The original game is a little hard for me to judge because I've never really been good at point-and-click games, but it's important because it's another genre that Mario has now attached himself to. He is the man of 3 billion games and 98 different genres. Even though I've never been great at point-and-click games, this game was surprisingly straightforward and intuitive from what I played. And that's one of the more comforting things about Mario. I feel like they can usually make anything straightforward and intuitive. The premise of the game is that Mario and Luigi must stop Bowser from creating an environmental disaster in the South Pole. In the process, Bowser captures Mario and it's up to Luigi to save him, so this may well be the first game where Luigi gets the spotlight. And in case you were wondering, yeah, this is apparently where the Ouija meme came from. That sprite is just so dumb that it's funny. Stuff like this allows crappy games to be immortal. The goal of the game is to travel back in time to an ancient historical period to hunt down stolen artifacts so you can return them to their rightful place. You walk around talking to people, click on weirdo looking Koopas to get them to drop artifacts, and then you bring the artifact to its intended destination. Then they ask you some questions about the artifact and you have to answer them correctly, or they'll assume you're trying to sell them a fake item and they hang up the phone. After handing in the artifact successfully, you can take a picture of the exhibit. On the surface, it's not offensively bad as far as I'm concerned, it's just kinda weird. It's supposed to be an educational game where they tell you what the artifacts are and why they were important within their historical context. Unfortunately, its value as an educational tool is dubious, as the game contains a lot of straight up wrong information. If you look at its Mario wiki page, there's an entire section called Mistakes and Errors, and it takes up a good third of the page. That's disappointing, but also very funny. Just to think that they went to all this effort to make an educational game and somehow the guy in charge of fact-checking the educational game did not show up to work. Although I can't say I was ever gonna trust this game as a legitimate source of information. Could you imagine putting Mario is Missing in an annotated bibliography? The Super Nintendo and NES versions try to reinterpret the point-and-click nature into a pseudo-platformer that looks like somebody put Mario sprites in an LJN game. Fundamentally, it's trying to do the same thing, except it's far more cumbersome and borderline broken at times. I can't even figure out how to do anything in this game without a walkthrough. It's kind of ironic that I had an easier time with an actual point-and-click adventure title than I did with a genre that I'm far more used to. Typically, I think Mario on a Nintendo platform is a safe bet. Usually, the worst Mario games we've seen thus far are either just simply mediocre or they're inferior ports of otherwise good video games. This, on the other hand, is just piss. It is not good at all. If anything, check out the PC version if you must, but otherwise, stay away. Then there's Mario's Time Machine, which is similar to Mario is Missing in that it is an educational point-and-click title, or at least I think that's supposed to be what it is. The premise is that Bowser has traveled back through time to steal numerous historical artifacts, and it's up to Mario to use his time machine to get them back and in the process, learn a bunch of historical facts that are most likely wrong. Not a joke, by the way. Just like Mario is Missing, this is a game that claims to be educational, which is apparently just full of information that is just straight up not true. I guess you could say this game is a lot like a Wikipedia page, and that it's a very good place to start researching, but you're gonna want to contact a bunch of third-party sources just to verify everything. Since the game starts you right in front of the time machine, I figured they probably wanted me to give it a spin, so the first thing I did was go to Washington, D.C. in 1776 AD, the year the United States was born. I assumed that since Washington, D.C. was an option, something as colloquial as that would have some relevance in the game. Of course, what I didn't know is that Washington, D.C. was actually founded in 1790 and technically didn't exist in 1776. That's hilarious, the one historical fact that I inadvertently learned by playing this game, and it's because I googled it on a whim while writing the script. According to the game, the land that would eventually become Washington, D.C. was actually inhabited by dinosaurs in 1776. That's a neat little factoid, I didn't think they'd survive that long. Okay, seriously though, this is how it works. In the room to the left of the time machine, there are Koopas, and when you stomp Koopas, they give you artifacts that belong to a specific place and time period that it tells you. You then punch that time period into the time machine and it sends you there. The goal is to return the artifact to its rightful time and place, and to do that, you have to do an elaborate trading quest with the denizens of the time and place you're in, while also using the dialogue to fill in historical facts about the artifact and the historical figure that it belongs to. You click on the blanks and you fill them in based on a long list of predetermined words. Essentially what this means is that if you already have some actual historical knowledge yourself, without even talking to people, you can usually kinda wing it and fill in the info just based on your own education. Much like the PC version of Mario is Missing, I do not find this to be an aggressively bad game. It'd be more effective as an educational tool if it wasn't a minefield of inaccuracy, but it's straightforward and playable, mundane though it may be. The Super Nintendo version is relatively faithful without being way too awkward or broken, which is more than can be said for the SNES version of Mario is Missing, but still not a game I would write home about. And don't even get me started on the NES version. Mostly because it came out a year later, and I'm still trying to do this largely in order of release. I'll talk about it later, is what I'm saying. Super Mario All-Stars is the perfect example of how to remake a game. This is a collection of 4 Super Mario Bros. Titles on the NES and Famicom, those being Super Mario Bros. 1 through 3, including both versions of Super Mario Bros. 2. All of these games are heavily remastered from the ground up with cutting-edge 16-bit graphics and soundtrack. It also had some excellent quality of life improvements like save files, which was far more expected by this point in time. Fundamentally, these games are the same, but this might be the best way to play them. Today, when I hear the term remaster, I think, remaster. You mean this, right? Yes, very remastered. Mario All-Stars kind of blurs the line between remaster and remake because it's fundamentally the same except for basic QOL improvements in audio-visual, but in this case, that's really all you need. These games don't really need bells and whistles, they just needed a save feature, especially lost levels. Yoshi's Safari is a game for the SNES Super Scope and was also the first game where the Western localization refers to Princess Peach instead of Toadstool. In Japan, she was always known as Peach, but this was the first known use of that title overseas. And now you know. Much like Super Scope 6, this is one of those games whose effect doesn't really translate outside of its original context. It's entirely playable through emulation, but dragging a mouse across the screen to click on enemies doesn't have the same effect as holding a blaster and aiming it at the screen. That being said, it's still an interesting title for a number of reasons. On paper, the concept is really badass. You play as Mario with a bazooka riding on Yoshi's back, blasting enemies to bits. It's like if you modded Red Dead Redemption to let you play as Mario riding on a Yoshi. Somebody probably did that already. Naturally, the game takes a first-person perspective of Mario on Yoshi's back, walking through a Mode 7-driven 3D environment shooting enemies out of the air. It's no Doom, but it's probably the closest Mario has ever gotten to being a first-person shooter, even to this day. Wouldn't it be cool if the SNES port of Doom actually let you use the Super Scope? Actually, it'd probably be really bad. You know what, I don't even know why I brought that up. As for Yoshi's Safari, without having a Super Scope in my hands, it's hard to know exactly how well it works in its intended context, but I have read that it was relatively well enjoyed by critics at the time. Presentationally, the marriage of pseudo 3D graphics with a physical shooty gun that you hold in your hand in real life was pretty forward-looking for the time. The modern equivalent would be something like if the Wii had good graphics. Wait. The Wii came out 17 years ago? Is Wii considered retro now? I'm not sure I'm ready for that conversation. Yoshi's Safari works well enough, although there are some annoying boss fights with projectiles that will fly in front of or very close to Yoshi, making it very easy to shoot him by complete accident. It's a mistake that's almost impossible to avoid at times. Otherwise, it's a serviceable game and an important footnote in the history of Mario. And now you can tell everyone that Mario had an FPS game, and when they call you stupid, bam, Yoshi's Safari. And that day, it was revealed that everyone was stupid except for you. Remember, y'all, arm yourselves with knowledge. Mario and Wario is a game for the Super Nintendo Mouse that was only released in Japan. In this game, you play as a fairy thing and you have to fly around the screen to create blocks and destroy obstacles so that a blinded Mario, Yoshi, or Princess Peach can find their way across an entire level to reach Luigi. It is a goofy-ass game, and its biggest selling point is probably just its comical overtones. Wario flying by in a little biplane and just dropping things on their heads, and instead of trying to take it off, they just wander into certain death. As a game, it's engaging for the first 5 minutes, but it quickly loses its appeal as you realize 90% of the game is just waiting for the right moment to make things happen for your otherwise blind, witless, defenseless companions. Usually, when a game doesn't make it outside of Japan, it's a little bit sad, but this time I think I'll survive. Wario's Woods is a game that doesn't feature Mario at all, but it does feature Wario, Toad, and Birdo, so it's a little hard to say that this isn't a Mario game. Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo and the non-Super Nintendo, Wario's Woods is a puzzle game where you play as Toad and you run around carrying bombs to blow up brightly colored monsters and then face off against the Grim Reaper. It's kinda like Dr. Mario if you were inside of the bottle and the pills were explosive. Some of the monsters have different strategies and approaches that you need to learn in order to beat them. Like some need to be hit twice, some need to be hit diagonally, and some change color. There is strategy and depth to this game, and I don't think I've ever felt unsatisfied when playing it. You can pick up one enemy or bomb at a time, or an entire stack, or you can run up a wall of enemies and cut a stack in half. It's one of the few games since Super Mario Bros. 2 that acknowledges just how strong Toad is. Since then, though, he's kinda let himself go. This is a game that I don't see a lot of people talking about, and I find that kinda sad because, at least to my way of thinking, this is a very good game. I think what might have put some people off is the learning curve. The gameplay won't necessarily click instantaneously, and the learning curve is steeper than most puzzle games, at least at the time. But if you really put your mind to it, it quickly becomes a lot of fun. Setting up combos in this game just feels great, and it never gets old. I never thought that a game where you play as Toad of all characters could be this fun, but damn it, it is. And it's also wild to think they were still putting out NES games as late as 1994. The Super Nintendo version has a lot more gameplay modes and improved graphics, obviously, although they added in these weird voice clips whenever you get a sick combo.
Hello!
I'm not sure why they did that, but at least you can laugh at it. Do you guys remember earlier when I said that I would get to the NES version of Mario's Time Machine in due time? Yeah, I meant like right now. Mario's Time Machine for the NES is far more like a platformer than any other version of the game. You'd think that'd make it more intuitive, but unfortunately this version is kinda terrible. The platforming is very wonky, and the puzzle solving is very unintuitive, and without a guide, you are just completely lost. Well, at least I am. Maybe you're built different. I'm sure this game has fans, but you know what else has fans? Computers. And also The Witcher 3, come on, totally overrated. And finally, we got Wario Land, also known as a Super Mario Land 3. This is the first game where Wario was the star of his own game. Wario Land would become its own series, and Wario would have tons of spin-offs of his own. Spin-offs of spin-offs, in fact. I think with Wario, there is less concern about brand image and whatnot than with Mario, allowing it to be a little more on the edge, which is probably why he is the way that he is in Smash.
Wario loves garlic. He eats whole cloves of it day and night.
This also allows the games to be more experimental without jeopardizing Mario's reputation for intuitive, easily accessible gameplay systems. The premise of the game is that Wario wants to get an actual castle of his own instead of stealing Mario's, so he goes on a quest to steal a statue of Princess Peach with the intention of selling it to Mario and using the money to build that castle. And that's what we call entrepreneurship. Or theft. I don't know. Much like its predecessors, the game is a 2D platformer, but much unlike its predecessors, there is a lot more in the way of combat and exploration. The previous games did have some of that, but not nearly to the extent of this one, and it makes the game feel fresh and new. Wario himself handles far differently than Mario. He's less of an agile acrobat and more of a human tank that just charges through and takes control whether they like it or not. Wario can lift enemies over his head with a single hand and then chuck them. He can ground pound and shake enemies loose and upside down, which might make it the first game with the ground pound, with this game coming out before Super Mario 64. He has this dash move where he tackles into enemies with his full weight, slamming them into oblivion. Compared to previous Super Mario Land titles, the game is a lot more mechanical. It's called Super Mario Land 3, but really it's a lot more like Kirby. There are a lot of special moves and power-ups, there are secret pathways everywhere, there's an entire treasure system where you have to find keys and treasure chests. It's a surprisingly apt comparison. Wario can get a fire-breathing alligator hat that acts as a flamethrower. There's a bunny hat that lets him dash around in the sky like a madman. The spike hat allows him to stick to ceilings like these moving conveyor belts with the coins. That never gets old.
He also attacks by farting.
From the standpoint of presentation, the game is excellent for a Game Boy title, with very detailed sprites and awesome music. If there's one thing that sucks about this game, it's the boss fights. Compared to Super Mario Land 2, where you just learn the attack patterns and wait for an opportunity to jump on them, they're often more Zelda-like in that you're constantly waiting for them to do the right thing, and if you fail to take advantage of it, you have to do this hokey-pokey bullshit for 20 minutes to wait for him to do it again. I especially hate this stupid idiot, where you have to catch a rock out of the air, but only after it hits the ground and extinguishes the flame. Then you have to throw it at him and pray to Waluigi's that the unclear hitboxes actually connect. And also, in between all of this, he is destroying the floor. There are just weird things like this that don't feel like they were adequately playtested. Of course, even the best games have some bumps in the road, little areas that a lot of us wish we could just gloss over, so I wouldn't call this a deal breaker in the face of all the things the game does well. Most people are going to be more familiar with the later Wario Land titles, which I assume are more polished than this one, and probably better overall. But if you haven't played this one, I think it's still worth a shot. And like they say in Wario Land, wah! And would you look at that, it's an entire episode without a single Donkey Kong port. Now before I sign off, I do want to apologize for taking 3 years to make this video. I got insanely sidetracked with real life events and whatnot, and I'm sorry if this is not the video you wanted to see. I realize there is more to life than Mario, for instance, Wario. Otherwise, it has been a long ride to get to where we are now, and the next episode is going to be even more exciting because we're closing in on the big boy titles. You know the ones I'm talking about. So I'll see you again in like 2 decades or something, and thank you so much for watching my video.